The smell hit before the front door opened. Fried chicken, collard greens, pound cake cooling on a wire rack in a kitchen that had no air conditioning and did not need permission to feed 40 people. During the Great Depression, black churches across the South became the one place where a full meal was guaranteed, not a charity meal, a dignity meal, cooked by women who stretched $10 into a banquet and never wrote a single recipe down. Number 12 on this list kept entire families alive through winters that had no mercy. Number 7 is the dish every church cook guarded with her life and never fully shared the recipe for. And number 10 required a Bible just to make it. The food industry did not build these recipes, it buried them. Hit subscribe because these are the meals worth remembering. Here are 25 black church recipes from the Great Depression you need to try. Number 25, cat head biscuits. They got the name because they were the size of a cat's head, and in Depression era black churches, that size was the point. A single biscuit could fill a child for most of a Sunday. The recipe called for nothing more than flour, lard, buttermilk, and a pinch of salt. No rolling pin. The dough was patted out by hand on a floured board, torn into rounds, and pressed flat with a palm. They came out of a wood-fired oven with a golden crust that cracked when pulled apart and a soft, steaming center that held butter like a sponge. Every church mother had her own ratio, and none of them measured a thing. The biscuit was the foundation of the entire church table. Everything else was built around it. Number 24, chicken hash. This was not the brunch item served in hotel restaurants today. In black church kitchens, during the 1930s, chicken hash meant taking every last scrap off a bird that had already given its broth to Sunday's soup. The leftover meat was chopped fine, mixed with diced potatoes and onion, seasoned with salt, black pepper, and sage, then fried in a cast iron skillet with bacon drippings until the bottom turned crisp. The dish stretched one chicken across 2 meals for a family of 6. The crisp bottom layer was scraped up with a spatula and served alongside the soft hash on top. Simple, resourceful, and completely invisible to anyone who did not grow up watching a grandmother strip a carcass bare with her fingers. Number 23, collard greens with ham hocks. The pot started early Saturday morning. A smoked ham hock went into a deep stock pot with water, and it simmered for hours until the meat slid off the bone and the broth turned dark and rich. Then the collards went in, washed 3 or 4 times to get the grit out, stripped from the thick center stems, torn by hand into rough pieces. They cooked low and slow until they were tender enough to cut with the side of a fork. The potlikker at the bottom was as important as the greens themselves. Church members soaked cornbread in it, drank it from a cup, saved it for the next pot of rice. During the Depression, collard greens grew in nearly every backyard garden in the rural South. They cost nothing and fed everyone. Number 22, pear salad. This was one of the strangest looking dishes on the church table and one of the most beloved. A canned pear, half place cut side up on a leaf of iceberg lettuce, the hollow filled with a spoonful of mayonnaise, and the whole thing topped with a sprinkle of grated cheddar cheese. That was it. Canned pears were cheap and available year-round at any general store. The dish required no cooking, no oven, and no skill beyond opening a can and arranging a plate. Church women assembled dozens of them on long trays before the congregation arrived. Children ate them with their fingers. Adults pretended not to. The combination of cold, sweet fruit, sharp cheese, and mayonnaise made no sense on paper, but made perfect sense on a paper plate at a summer revival. Number 21, Teacakes. Before store-bought cookies existed in most black communities, there were teacakes, large, flat, round, barely sweet, flavored with vanilla and a little nutmeg. The dough was rolled out on a floured table and cut with the rim of a drinking glass. Church mothers baked them by the dozens for Sunday school, funerals, and revivals. The recipe required flour, sugar, butter or lard, eggs, and buttermilk. Children waited at the kitchen door while the first batch cooled on a piece of brown paper. A batch of tea cakes could be made for pennies and lasted an entire week, stored in a tin can with a tight lid. The flavor was plain by modern standards, but the smell of them baking was the smell of somebody's house on a Saturday afternoon. Number 20, glazed ham. A whole ham at a black church supper during the Depression was a statement. It meant somebody had raised a hog and done the smoking themselves. The glaze was made from whatever sweetener was available: brown sugar, sorghum, or cane syrup mixed with mustard and a little vinegar. Whole cloves were pressed into the scored fat in diamond patterns. The ham went into the oven and was basted every 30 minutes until the outside turned dark and glossy. A single ham fed 40 people when carved thin enough. The children circled back for the burnt edges where the sugar had caramelized against the bone. When the ham was gone, the supper was over. The bone went home with whoever was making soup that week. Here's something worth saying out loud. The black church during the Great Depression was not simply a place of worship. It was a survival system. When federal relief programs offered almost nothing to black families, and when white relief agencies turned them away, the church filled the gap with the only currency it had: food. Women who could barely feed their own children cooked for entire congregations. They pooled flour and lard the way banks were supposed to pool money. They organized meal rotations so no family went an entire week without a hot plate. The recipes on this list did not come from cookbooks. They came from necessity and the absolute refusal to let hunger win on a Sunday. Number 19, field peas with snaps. Field peas were among the most important crops in the rural Black South during the Depression, and the church kitchen turned them into something that went far beyond survival. The peas were picked fresh in summer, shelled by hand on the front porch by whoever was available, children included, and cooked in a deep pot with a piece of salt pork or a smoked ham hock for seasoning. The snaps were the immature pods that had not fully developed peas inside. They went into the pot whole, adding a green, slightly fibrous texture that balanced the starchy richness of the mature peas. Low heat, enough water to cover, and patience. By the time they were done, the broth had thickened into a creamy liquid that tasted like pork and earth and summer all at once. In the church context, field peas were democratic. They grew in nearly every garden, required no expensive fertilizer, and a single bushel could feed a congregation. Women brought them already cooked in large bowls covered with dish towels. The potlikker was soaked up with cornbread, and the peas were served alongside whatever meat was available that Sunday. In years when there was no meat, the peas were the meal. Protein, iron, fiber, all from a crop that grew in poor soil and asked for almost nothing in return. Black farmers had been growing them for generations before any government extension program said a word about it. The knowledge did not come from a pamphlet, it came from the ground, and the church table was where that knowledge fed people who had nowhere else to turn. A pot of field peas with snaps, served with cornbread and a glass of cold water, was a complete meal. It did not look like much. It did not need to. Number 18, banana pudding. Every black church supper during the Depression had a dessert table, and banana pudding sat at the center of it. The recipe was simple: vanilla wafers, sliced bananas, and a custard made from eggs, sugar, milk, and a little flour layered in a baking dish and topped with meringue browned in the oven. Bananas were cheap. By the 1930s, United Fruit had flooded American markets with Central American bananas at prices even the poorest families could afford. A bunch cost a few pennies. The wafers came from a box. The custard required nothing exotic, yet the finished dish tasted rich, creamy, and almost luxurious. Church women assembled it hours before the meal, letting the wafers soften into the custard until the layers blurred together. The meringue on top turned golden and slightly wept in the summer heat. Children fought over the corners of the dish where the custard had thickened against the glass. Number 17, boiled peanuts. Raw peanuts were one of the cheapest crops in the South, and black churchwomen turned them into something worth lingering over. Green peanuts, freshly pulled from the ground, were dumped into a large pot of heavily salted water and boiled for hours until the shells went soft and the nuts inside turned creamy. The texture was nothing like a roasted peanut. The shell gave way between the teeth like wet leather. The nut inside was almost buttery, warm, and soaked through with salt. A bushel of green peanuts cost next to nothing during harvest season, and a single pot fed dozens. They showed up at church picnics, homecomings, and summer revivals, piled into bowls with the brine still dripping. Nobody needed a recipe. The ratio was peanuts, salt, water, and thyme. Number 16, fig preserves. Nearly every black homestead in the Deep South had a fig tree in the yard. Brown turkey figs, Celeste figs, whatever variety had been planted by a grandmother or great-grandmother decades before. The fruit ripened in waves through the summer, soft and fragile, too delicate to ship anywhere. Church women cooked them down whole with sugar and a little lemon juice in heavy pots, stirring slowly until the syrup thickened and the figs turned translucent. The preserves were ladled into glass jars and sealed with paraffin wax. A single tree could produce enough fruit for 30 jars. They showed up at the church table spread on biscuits, spooned over pound cake, or eaten straight from the jar with a spoon. The fig tree asked for nothing. It just kept giving. Number 15, oatmeal cake. This cake has nearly disappeared from the American table, but during the Depression, it was a staple of black church bake sales. The recipe called for oats soaked in boiling water, which softened them into a thick paste that gave the cake a dense, moist texture, unlike anything made with flour alone. The topping set it apart, a broiled mixture of brown sugar, butter, coconut, and chopped pecans that bubbled and caramelized under the heat. The broiler had to be watched closely. 30 seconds too long and the coconut burned black. Oats cost almost nothing. A single cake served a dozen people and required no frosting, no decoration, and no apology. Church women who made it well were known for it the way some women were known for their singing voice. Number 14, baked hen with pan gravy. A baked hen was the queen of the black church table during the Depression, and the gravy made from her drippings was the crown. The bird was typically an old laying hen past her prime, too tough for frying, but perfect for slow roasting. She was seasoned inside and out with salt, black pepper, and whatever dried herbs were on hand. Onion quarters went into the cavity. Then she went into a heavy roasting pan at a moderate heat for several hours, basted with her own fat every 30 minutes until the skin turned deep golden brown and the leg pulled away from the body with almost no resistance. The gravy was where the real craft lived. Once the hen came out, the drippings stayed in the bottom of the pan, rendered fat, caramelized juice, and whatever had stuck to the metal. Flour was sprinkled directly into the hot drippings and stirred with a wooden spoon until it formed a paste. Then milk was added slowly, a little at a time, while the cook stirred without stopping. The gravy thickened into something rich and brown, with small dark flecks of seasoning suspended throughout. This was not a complicated dish, but it required experience, knowing when the hen was done by pressing the thigh, knowing how much flour to add by feel, knowing how fast to pour so the gravy did not lump. These skills did not come from a cookbook. They came from watching a mother or a grandmother make the same dish 100 times in the same kitchen with the same pan. Nobody wrote the ratio down because nobody needed to. The hands remembered. The hen fed the table. The gravy fed the soul. Number 13, yeast rolls. Yeast rolls at a black church supper were a luxury and everyone knew it. Yeast cost money. The dough took time. A woman had to start early in the morning mixing flour, sugar, warm milk, butter, and yeast into a soft dough that she kneaded until it was smooth and elastic. Then she waited for it to rise. Then she punched it down, shaped it into small rounds, set them in a grease pan, and waited again. They came out of the oven, tall, golden, and impossibly light. The smell filled the fellowship hall before anyone saw the basket. Yeast rolls meant somebody had invested time and ingredients that could have gone elsewhere. They were an offering, not a side dish. The woman who brought yeast rolls had given her morning to the church. Number 12, purple hull peas. Purple hull peas stained everything they touched: fingers, towels, the rim of the pot, the front of the apron. But they were among the most reliable crops in the black southern garden during the Depression. The peas were shelled by hand and cooked with a piece of smoked pork and enough water to make a thick broth. They came out soft, earthy, and slightly sweet, with a flavor deeper than black-eyed peas. The purple hull variety thrived in the poorest soil and the hottest weather, perfect for the clay-heavy ground across Mississippi, Alabama, and Georgia. Served in large bowls with cornbread on the side, the potlikker was considered the best part. Families who could not afford meat all week ate purple hull peas on Sunday and called it enough. Number 11, deviled eggs. A plate of deviled eggs at a black church supper was a quiet show of skill. Every woman in the congregation made them, and every woman made them differently. The eggs were boiled, halved, and the yolks mashed with mustard, a little pickle relish, salt, pepper, and enough mayonnaise to hold it together. The filling was spooned or piped back into the whites and dusted with paprika. The dish cost almost nothing. Eggs came from backyard hens. Mustard came from a jar that lasted months. Yet the result looked deliberate and refined, the kind of food that suggested effort even when there was barely any. The paprika on top was purely decorative. It added no flavor anyone could taste, but a plate of deviled eggs without it looked unfinished, and no churchwoman would bring an unfinished plate to the fellowship table. Here is the uncomfortable truth that no history book puts on the cover. During the Great Depression, the federal relief programs that kept white families from starving were systematically denied to black families across the South. The New Deal employment programs hired white workers first. Agricultural subsidies went to white landowners who then evicted their black sharecroppers. Surplus food distribution centers were segregated, and in many counties, black families were turned away entirely. The church kitchen was not a quaint tradition. It was an emergency response to a government that had decided quietly and bureaucratically that black hunger was not a priority. Every casserole, every pot of peas, every cake baked from the cheapest ingredients available was an act of organized resistance. The women who cooked did not call it that. They called it Sunday dinner, but the effect was the same. Number 10, scripture cake. Scripture cake required a Bible to make. That was the entire point. Every ingredient was listed not by name, but by a Bible verse. Judges chapter 5, verse 25 called for butter. Jeremiah chapter 6, verse 20 called for cane sugar. 1 Samuel chapter 14 verse 25 called for honey. 1 Kings chapter 4 verse 22 meant flour. Nahum chapter 3 verse 12 pointed to figs. Numbers chapter 17 verse 8 gave almonds. The result was a dense, spiced fruit cake that tasted like a cross between a fig loaf and a holiday cake. Black church women used scripture cake as a teaching tool. Children learned their verses while they measured ingredients. The kitchen became a classroom and the cake was the reward. Number 9, prune cake. Prunes were cheap, shelf-stable, and available at every general store during the Depression. The prunes were stewed until soft, chopped, and folded into a spice batter made with buttermilk, cinnamon, nutmeg, and allspice. Some versions had a buttermilk glaze poured over the top while the cake was still warm, which soaked into the crumb and made it almost pudding-like. It was not a beautiful cake. The color was dark brown, nearly black, and the surface was plain, but the taste was deep, almost like molasses and warm spice pressed into a loaf. It lasted longer than any frosted layer cake on the table, staying moist for days in a covered dish. Prune cake was built to endure, and the women who baked it knew that a cake that kept was worth more than a cake that impressed. Time equals 1 second / greater than number 8. Blackberry dumplings. Wild blackberries grew along fences, roadsides, and the edges of church property across the rural South, free for anyone willing to scratch their arms picking them. Church women gathered them by the bucket in July and August, brought them to the kitchen, and turned them into a dessert that required almost nothing else. The berries were cooked down with sugar and water until they made a thick, dark syrup. Strips of biscuit dough were dropped into the simmering fruit and covered with a lid. The dumplings steamed until they puffed up and soaked through with berry juice, turning purple on the outside and soft as bread on the inside. The dish was served warm in bowls with the syrup pooled around the dumplings. It stained everything it touched: fingers, aprons, tablecloths, and nobody cared. A pot of blackberry dumplings at a church supper disappeared before the main dishes were half gone. Number 7, potato salad. Potato salad at a black church supper during the Depression was not a side dish. It was a centerpiece, and the woman who made it carried a reputation that followed her across decades. The potatoes were boiled whole, peeled while still warm, and cut into chunks that held their shape. The dressing was built around mayonnaise, yellow mustard, sweet pickle relish, and hard-boiled eggs chopped into the mix. Some women added celery, others added onion. A few added both and a pinch of sugar that nobody admitted to. The bowl was always enormous. A church supper potato salad fed 40 or 50 people, and it had to be made the night before so the flavors could settle overnight in the icebox. By the time it reached the table, the dressing had soaked into the potatoes, and the whole thing held together in a way that fresh potato salad never does. Every congregation had a woman whose potato salad was the standard. Her recipe was requested, complimented, and never fully shared. She left out one ingredient when she wrote it down, or changed the measurement just enough to keep the result slightly different from hers. This was not secrecy, it was ownership. In a world where black women owned very little, a recipe that made people close their eyes when they tasted it was property worth protecting. The cost was almost nothing. Potatoes were among the cheapest foods in America. Eggs came from the yard. Mustard and relish lasted for weeks. Yet the finished dish carried a weight that had nothing to do with its ingredients. A church supper without potato salad was not a church supper at all. It was just food on a table. Number 6, sorghum cake. Before refined white sugar became affordable, sorghum syrup was the sweetener of the rural black South. It was pressed from sorghum cane grown locally, boiled down into a dark, thick syrup with a bittersweet flavor that tasted nothing like molasses or honey. Church women used it to sweeten cakes when sugar was too expensive to justify. The cake was dense, dark, and moist, baked in a cast iron skillet or a simple round pan greased with lard. The crumb had a mineral depth from the sorghum that white sugar could never produce. It was not a pretty cake. It did not rise high or take a frosting well, but it tasted like the land it came from, earthy and complicated and impossible to mistake for anything store-bought. A sorghum cake at the church table meant somebody had access to a cane press, which meant somebody in the congregation still farmed, which meant the old ways had not yet died. By the 1950s, cheap granulated sugar replaced sorghum in most kitchens, and the cake quietly vanished from the dessert table. Number 5, chicken pot pie. This was not the frozen kind sealed in aluminum. Black church chicken pot pie during the Depression was a deep dish affair baked in a casserole pan with a thick, lard-based crust on top and sometimes on the bottom. The filling was leftover chicken, pulled from the bone and chopped, mixed with diced potatoes, carrots, onions, and peas, all swimming in a gravy made from the bird's own broth, thickened with flour. The crust was rolled out by hand, draped over the top, and crimped at the edges with a fork. A single pot pie fed 8 people from 1 chicken and a few root vegetables. It was the dish that turned almost nothing into something that looked and tasted like prosperity. The crust was the luxury. The filling was the reality. Number 4, sweet potato bread. Sweet potatoes were the engine of the Black Southern garden during the Depression. They grew in poor soil, stored well through winter, and could be turned into a dozen different dishes. Sweet potato bread was among the quietest of them. The potatoes were boiled or baked, mashed smooth, and folded into a batter made with flour, sugar, eggs, butter, and warm spices. Cinnamon was standard. Nutmeg appeared in most versions. The loaf baked slowly until it turned golden brown. It was denser than regular bread and sweeter, somewhere between a quick bread and a cake, and it kept well for days, wrapped in cloth. Church women baked it for sick visits and shut-ins, delivering it still warm in a kitchen towel, the bread you brought when there were no words. Number 3, sweet milk pie. When there was nothing left in the pantry but flour, sugar, butter, and a bottle of sweet milk, this pie appeared. The filling was a simple custard: milk, sugar, eggs, a spoonful of flour to thicken, and a splash of vanilla. Poured into a homemade pie shell and baked until the top set with faint brown spots. It was not flashy. It did not compete with the coconut cakes or the fruit cobblers for attention. But it was the pie that could be made when everything else had run out, and it tasted like comfort in its plainest form. Church women called it sweet milk pie to distinguish it from buttermilk pie, which used the sour milk left after churning. The sweet version was gentler, almost like a baked vanilla custard in a crust. Children asked for it by name. Number 2, sugar cookies. Sugar cookies from a black church kitchen during the Depression were not decorated. They were not shaped with cutters or frosted with colored icing. They were round, flat, slightly crisp at the edges, soft in the center, and dusted with a thin coat of granulated sugar that caught the light. The recipe was flour, butter or lard, sugar, eggs, vanilla, and a pinch of baking powder. The dough was rolled out on a floured board and cut into rounds with the top of a tin can. They baked fast, 10 minutes at most, and cooled on a sheet of brown paper laid across the kitchen table. Church women stacked them in tin cans lined with wax paper for bake sales. A dozen sold for a nickel. The profit went to the building fund. The taste went to memory. Number 1 is not a recipe, it is the table itself. The long folding tables covered in white cloth or butcher paper pushed together in the fellowship hall after the sermon, where every dish on this list found its place. During the Great Depression, that table was the most important surface in the Black community, more important than any desk in any government office, more important than any counter at any store that would not serve a Black customer. The fellowship table was where hunger ended and dignity began. It was democratic. The deacon's wife and the sharecropper's daughter ate from the same plates. Nobody asked who brought what, and nobody left without eating. The recipes on this list survived because that table survived. The women who cooked them had cast iron, a wood stove, a garden, and each other. That was enough to feed old people through the worst economic disaster in American history. The table is still set today. Canned salmon and onions on toast was the meal she made on days she was tired. Not tired the way young people are tired. Tired the way a woman gets after 50 years of feeding everyone else. She would open the tall can, drain it, pick out the larger bones, and fry the fish with sliced white onion until the onion went soft and the salmon crisped at the edges. Laid over buttered toast, it was not a fancy plate. It was a 10-minute meal she made for herself, alone at the small table by the window, where she ate quietly after the grandchildren had gone. Canned Alaskan salmon was an affordable household staple by the 1940s, available at every corner grocery and reliable in ways fresh fish often was not. After she was gone, her children found 3 cans in the cupboard above the stove. Nobody opened them for a long time. That is what a plain meal can carry. A whole person held in something as ordinary as a can on a kitchen shelf. Time equals 1 second / greater than in the weeks before the first frost, when fields were still giving. Crowder peas showed up in every Black kitchen in the rural South in quantities that could feed the whole congregation. A variety of field pea named for the way seeds crowd each other in the pod. Crowder peas had been a Southern Black farming staple since before the Civil War, and by the 1940s, they were as tied to late summer church suppers as anything else on the table. You cooked them with fatback, a piece of smoked pork that gave the pot a low, savory richness, and let them go until the potlikker turned cloudy and the peas softened but held their shape. The fatback was not window dressing, it was the chemistry. Rendered fat coated the starch in each pea, making them silky instead of chalky. You could use the same peas on the same stove and miss the dish entirely by adding the fatback too late. What looked like a simple pot of field peas was in fact precision that nobody around that stove called precision because they had always known it without a word for it. Number 26, souse loaf. Souse was the Saturday work that produced the Sunday platter. The church fathers boiled a whole hog head with the cheeks, ears, and snout in a covered pot of vinegar water, bay leaf, hot pepper, and salt for almost 5 hours. The meat fell off the bone, got chopped fine, and went back into the pot with its own gelatin. It set up overnight in bread loaf pans into a tangy, trembling block, streaked pink and white. Sliced thin onto saltines, it traveled to every potluck table in the rural Black South through 1967. By the 1980s, the hog heads were harder to source, and souse left the fellowship hall for good. Stewed chicken and rice was started the morning of service, sometimes the night before. The bird, a whole hen, not a fryer, because a hen's age meant fat and flavor a young chicken couldn't give, went into the pot with onion, celery, garlic, bay leaves, black pepper, and water to cover. It simmered on low for 2 hours minimum, never boiled hard, because hard boiling makes the meat stringy and clouds the broth. When the meat came off the bone in clean pieces, the broth was strained, The rice stirred and raw to cook in the liquid until it absorbed every bit of flavor from the long simmer. Salt was added last, always last, because the broth concentrated as it cooked. This was the dish that fed the largest number for the least cost. A whole hen stretched to 12 when the rice absorbed the broth. In church kitchens from Georgia to Illinois through the 1950s, it appeared, when the congregation was large and the budget was not. The women who made it are gone. The knowledge of how slowly to go went with them. Snap bean and potato soup was the kind of dish that did not require a recipe so much as a memory. You broke the beans yourself, fresh from the garden in summer, dried or canned in the lean months, snapped each one at the joint the way you had been shown, and dropped them into a pot with quartered potatoes, a ham bone if you had it, or just salted water if you did not, and let everything go on low until the broth turned a soft, cloudy gold and the beans had given up their edges. There was a particular sound to this soup in the making: the pop of each snap bean, the knock of potatoes against the pot. And if you grew up in a kitchen where it was made, that sound meant something was coming that would fill you completely. Through the 1930s and 40s, snap beans and potatoes were among the most reliable crops in the gardens kept by black families across the rural South, grown because they stored well and could feed a household through lean weeks without fanfare. She made it through every fall. The pot has been quiet for years. Tomato gravy over a leftover biscuit was the Sunday morning move that nobody taught you because you were supposed to already know it. You made a roux, a spoonful of bacon fat worked into flour in a dry skillet until it turned the color of a brown paper bag, then poured in canned tomatoes and let the whole thing thicken into a gravy that was tangy and rich and dark at the edges. You laid it over a biscuit that had been split and left out overnight, one dry enough to drink up the gravy without going to mush. This was not a recipe for fresh biscuits. It was a recipe for the ones that were already there, the ones from yesterday's service, from the covered dish someone had left behind. The color told you when the roux was right. Too pale and it tasted raw, too dark and it turned bitter. Nobody wrote that down. You learned it by watching the skillet and knowing the difference. Number 29, chow relish. By 1963, every fellowship hall in the rural South had at least 3 jars of homemade chow lined up next to the cornbread platter, each one labeled with masking tape and a different woman's last name. The church mothers chopped end-of-season green tomatoes, white cabbage, sweet onion, and red bell pepper from their own backyard rows, then packed it all into pint jars with brine made from cider vinegar, white sugar, yellow mustard seed, celery seed, and a thumb of turmeric. The pot simmered on the back of the stove all afternoon. It cured for 3 weeks in a back pantry shelf before it ever met a plate of pintos. A spoonful of bright yellow chow on top of hot beans and a wedge of cornbread was Tuesday supper at home and Sunday dinner at church. The mason jars went home empty and washed. Almost nobody under 60 has tasted real homemade chow since 1985. But years before that rice pot reached its full simmer, the cornbread dressing had already claimed the big roasting pan and the place of honor on the harvest table. Cornbread dressing was baked in its own pan, made from crumbled cornbread mixed with biscuit crumbs, sautéed celery and onion, sage, poultry seasoning, eggs, black pepper, and enough chicken broth to make the mixture wet but not soupy. The ratio of cornbread to biscuit was the secret variable. Some women used all cornbread, some mixed it half and half, and neither group believed the other was doing it correctly. In black Southern church kitchens, through the 1950s, dressing appeared at Thanksgiving, Christmas, Homecoming Sunday, and any gathering significant enough to warrant a full spread. The woman who made the dressing held a specific position at the table. The pan is gone. The position went with her. Every church had one woman known for her chicken salad, and the debate over whose was best was never resolved, which was the point. She mixed shredded chicken with yellow mustard, sweet pickle relish, diced celery, and enough Duke's mayonnaise to bind it without going heavy, then laid it between slices of white bread before morning service. The secret was cooking the chicken the night before, so the meat tightened into clean, dry strands instead of wet shreds from a rushed bird. By the 1950s, cold chicken salad sandwiches were a church supper staple from Mississippi north to Chicago, made in large batches the evening before, needing no heat. At quarterly church dinners, the platter disappeared in the first 10 minutes. The woman who brought it stood just far enough away to appear modest while watching to see if people went back. They always did, and she knew they would. Skillet cabbage with smoked turkey was a weeknight workhorse that could feed 4 people for almost nothing and make the kitchen smell like something good was happening. You started with a head of green cabbage, chopped rough, and laid it into a skillet where a piece of smoked turkey neck or wing had already been browning in its own fat. The cabbage went in on top, the lid went on, and the whole thing steamed and wilted down until the cabbage had absorbed the smoky drippings and gone from sharp to tender and sweet. By the 1970s, smoked turkey had replaced ham hocks in many African American kitchens as a leaner substitute that still delivered the same depth, particularly in households where health concerns had begun to reshape the cooking. The transformation was the whole point, that a vegetable people sometimes pushed aside could become the thing everyone reached for first, once the right piece of smoked meat changed what it was capable of being. Number 28, Ambrosia with sour cream. The 1960s church version had nothing to do with the airy whipped cream ambrosia that took over by the 1990s. The Sunday school teachers drained 2 cans of Dolly pineapple chunks, 1 jar of maraschino cherries, and a tin of mandarin oranges into a yellow Pyrex bowl. They folded in sweetened baker's coconut and a generous cup of Daisy sour cream, then chilled it overnight in the icebox. Some women added halved pecans from a backyard tree. It came to the fellowship hall in the same Pyrex it was made in, wrapped in a clean dish towel. Spooned next to ham, it cut the salt with something cold and tangy and faintly tropical. By 1978, the sour cream was gone, replaced by Cool Whip, and the old version was lost. Ambrosia was the dessert salad that appeared at every church homecoming table from about May through September, sitting at the edge between side dish and sweet. In its 1950s church form, it was layers of canned mandarin oranges, crushed pineapple, shredded coconut, miniature marshmallows, and sour cream folded through to bind everything into a cold, sweet, faintly tangy cloud. Ambrosia had begun as a luxury item in the 19th century South, made with fresh coconuts and oranges that only the prosperous could afford regularly. Canned goods democratized it entirely. By the 1940s, a can of mandarin oranges and a bag of coconut flakes made it accessible to every church kitchen. The women who brought it understood this history without needing to say it. What was once expensive was now theirs. The bowl was always empty before the other dishes. When the church ladies who brought it stopped coming, the ambrosia stopped too, replaced by nothing in particular. Vienna sausages and potatoes in a skillet was a meal that belonged to the middle of the week, far from Sunday's abundance and close enough to Friday to feel the thinning. You sliced the potatoes thin and laid them into a hot cast iron skillet with oil. Let them go until they crisped at the edges and the kitchen filled with that particular starchy sweetness. then added the sausages sliced on the diagonal and let everything come together in a pan that looked like it had been planned. It had not been planned. It had been assembled from what was on the shelf and what was in the bin, the way most good meals in these kitchens were assembled. In Black households from the 1950s through the 80s, Vienna sausages were the shelf protein that never ran out because running out was not allowed. The can cost almost nothing. The meal it made cost even less. And on the nights when the week had been long and the body was tired, it tasted like exactly enough. Number 24, pickled pig's feet. In the 1964 Fellowship Hall, the pink jar of pickled pig's feet sat at the corner of the table next to the saltines and the hot sauce. The trotters were boiled tender for 3 hours with onion, bay, and clove, then packed into wide-mouthed mason jars and covered with hot vinegar, sugar, and red pepper flakes. They cured a full week before anybody touched them. Eaten cold off the fork after Sunday service, they were tangy, gelatinous, and faintly sweet. The men's chorus would crowd that end of the table first. By the 1990s, the home version had given way to the gas station jar. Crackling cornbread arrived in cast iron and smelled like November. Cracklings, the crisp, rendered pieces of pork skin and fat left after lard making, were folded into standard cornbread batter before the skillet went into the oven. The cracklings distributed through the bread as it baked, leaving pockets of salty, porky richness in every slice, the skin slightly chewier where it had softened in the batter. Lard rendering from hog killing was an annual fall event in rural Black Southern communities through the mid-20th century, and cracklings were its immediate byproduct, available in November when the weather turned cold enough for the process. The practice of incorporating rendered pork fat into grain-based breads reaches back into West African cooking traditions, where animal fat has long enriched otherwise plain starches. By the 1970s, as home hog killing faded, cracklings became harder to find fresh. The cornbread that replaced crackling cornbread was easier and missing something it could not name. Crackling cornmeal griddle cakes were a post-church morning tradition in households where nothing from the hog went to waste. The crisp pork skin pieces left after lard rendering went into the batter before they went limp. Each cake went onto a dry cast iron griddle. The cracklings brought their own fat to the pan. They came up dense, golden, and slightly smoky. Nothing like a store pancake, nothing like plain cornbread, but something in between that belonged entirely to these kitchens. The women who made them knew the ratio by feel. Too many cracklings and the cakes crumbled. Too few and they tasted like nothing. The cakes told the truth. Butter beans were a church supper cornerstone in African American households from the 1930s through the 1960s. What the rest of the country called lima beans, cooked here with a ham hock until the potlikker thickened and the beans softened into something close to a gravy. The ham hock was the architecture of the dish, giving the broth its body and releasing strands of smoky meat that dissolved into the pot without being asked. Nothing about the process was rushed. You did not hurry butter beans, and anyone who tried ended up with a bowl that tasted correct but felt wrong, thin where it should have been rich. The women who made it right knew the dish was done when it smelled finished, not when the clock said so. Before the stew, you had dried beans and a bone. After, you had something that held a whole afternoon inside it. She made it every third Sunday through the fall in the same dented pot she had carried north from Georgia in 1951. When she died, the pot stayed on the stove for 3 days before anyone moved it. Number 30, tomato aspics salad. Nothing tells you 1965 was a different country, quite like a quivering red mold of tomato juice unmolded onto a glass plate at a Sunday potluck. The church mothers made it the night before, dissolving plain Knox gelatin into a saucepan of V8 and Worcestershire, folding in chopped celery, green pepper, and 1 diced hard-boiled egg. They poured the whole thing into a fluted ring mold borrowed from the women's auxiliary. By Sunday morning, it had set firm enough to slice. The fellowship hall ladies arranged it on a bed of iceberg with a dollop of Hellmann's in the center hole. It looked like jewelry. It tasted like cold seasoned tomato soup with a backbone. A staple from 1955 to about 1972, then it quietly vanished from the table. Deviled eggs went to church under a different name. You could not put the word devil on the fellowship table, not in those kitchens, not in those congregations, so they were called dressed eggs or salad eggs or simply the eggs, and everyone understood exactly what they were. The preparation was precise. Hard-boiled eggs, halved lengthwise, yolks mashed with mustard, mayonnaise, sweet pickle relish, salt, and a touch of vinegar, then piped the spoon back into the whites and dusted with paprika. The paprika was mandatory, not for flavor, but for finish, the visual signal that the eggs were complete. Church, women who made them brought a specific deviled egg plate, an oval platter with molded indentations for each half, which kept them from sliding and which was understood to belong to the woman who owned it the way a cast iron skillet belongs to whoever seasoned it. These plates are in estate sales now, the eggs long gone from the tables they once anchored. Sardines and saltines with hot sauce were not a meal anyone photographed or put on a table for company. They were what you ate at the kitchen counter on a Tuesday when you were alone and the refrigerator had nothing else to offer. You opened the flat tin, laid the fish on the crackers whole, added a few drops of hot sauce from the bottle that lived permanently next to the stove, and ate them standing up without a plate. Canned sardines had been a staple in African American households since at least the 1930s, packed in oil or mustard sauce, rich in protein and cheap enough that keeping a tin on the shelf cost nothing. And they carried none of the social performance that other food did. There was no technique to master, no ratio to calibrate. The knowing was simpler than that. You needed the hot sauce, you needed the saltines to still have their snap, and you needed to be the kind of person who did not require an audience to eat well. Some of the best meals these kitchens ever made were the ones nobody else saw. The cast iron had to be right before the eggs went in, not smoking, not barely warm, but sitting at that particular dry heat where a drop of water skittered across the surface instead of sitting still. Nobody named that temperature. You learned it by putting your hand near the pan, close enough to feel the difference between warm and ready. Number 25, hot water cornbread pones. Forget the sweet yellow square that bakeries call cornbread now. In 1962, the church kitchen produced hand-shaped pones made by pouring scalding water straight into white stone ground cornmeal with a teaspoon of salt and a heavy finger of bacon grease whisked in. The cornmeal cooked from the heat of the water alone. The deaconesses shaped the warm dough into oblong patties between 2 cupped palms, leaving the marks of their fingerprints in the sides, and fried them in a flat skillet of pure white lard until the outside cracked open golden and the inside steamed white. They went to the long fellowship table 6 pones to a platter wrapped in a clean flour sack to stay hot. Crisp outside, soft as wet grits inside. They needed nothing but cold butter and the Potlikker from a pot of collard greens. By 1980, almost no Sunday school child in town had ever eaten one. Those are 25 black church recipes from the Great Depression that deserve a place on the table today. Try the cathead biscuits. Try the sorghum cake. Try the scripture cake, and bring a Bible to the kitchen when you do. Drop in the comments. the dish your family turned into gold with almost nothing, the name of the woman who made it, the church where she served it. That record matters more than any cookbook ever written.